Good day, citizens, and good day, Thomas Jefferson, our podcast listeners. A very interesting couple of weeks featuring conversation with Professor Joe Ellis. And this week, you left me very thoughtful after your essay this week.
How's that, sir?
Well, you know, here we are looking at, well, I'm thinking of four individuals. Our man Jefferson, of course, the dreamer, and then the man connected to the ground, John Adams.
Saying, wait a minute, Mr. Jefferson.
The woman who saw both of them better than they saw themselves, I think, Abigail Adams.
Wife to one, friend to the other.
And then the genius who absorbed it all, Abraham Lincoln.
And Lincoln, this you'll see in the Jefferson essay, magnificently understood that Jefferson could have written any old sort of news release in July of 1776. Instead, he wrote one of the most imperishable and important documents in the history of the planet, because that's Jefferson's genius.
He didn't like Jefferson very much either, did he?
No, he knew that Jefferson was a racist and a man of his own time, a slaveholder and so on.
Yeah.
But he understood that Jefferson we can't just say he had a way with words. He understood something in a deep sense about human aspiration and was able to find language to embody that aspiration better than anyone, better than Plato, Aristotle, Shakespeare, Milton, you name it. Jefferson himself, in behavior, in his own character, maybe wasn't equal to his own genius, but of course that's true of almost everybody. If you look at Martin Luther King or Albert Einstein or J. Robert Oppenheimer or Hillary Clinton or any number of people, they're not ever quite what you wish from their most magnificent gestures and rhetoric. But Lincoln saw that, well, here's what he said, David. He said, Jefferson wrote, all men are created equal. He said, I don't know what he meant, but he probably didn't mean it in the fullest sense of the term. But we can't go on as a nation unless we read that sentence in the fullest sense of the term. We can't go on with a partial understanding of that sentence. We can only go on now with a full understanding of what it means for all human beings to be born equal.
It's a pretty powerful quartet to try to understand the American
Who's your favorite of the
dream.
four? Who's the greatest of the four?
Can I have a little time and think about that?
Yeah, but I'll say I still love Jefferson best in spite of everything.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when Theodore Roosevelt stood for election in 1904, a New York newspaper wrote the following headline endorsing him: Theodore with all your faults. And that's how I feel. Jefferson with all your limitations.
Well, without his dreamy nature, we wouldn't be in this country as it is.
But you know what? If you talk to Joseph Ellis, you can't help but like Adams more and more.
I want
and
to
more.
bring that up because for years on this show, you have accused me of
being an Adamsite.
That's right,
And
and
you
it
are,
turns
actually.
out so are you.
What?
Yes.
I'm ducking.
Yeah.
I'm bobbing and weaving over here.
Yeah.
I'm hiding behind hay bales.
I'll just leave it at that.
Really?
We can have that.
But you are an Adamsite.
Well, there's a part of me that is, but at my core, as a youth, I certainly was not.
You were what?
Oh, I was a Jeffersonian.
And are you
a dreamer?
now?
Why can't we do these things the right way?
Why can't we get it right? Why can't life be? Yeah.
On the other hand, you know, the other phrase that you use so often is, you know, Adams would say, "Really, Mr. Jefferson?
Have you looked at the real world lately? Have you looked around?"
And so, anyway, that's the fun of all this.
But so Lincoln was like of all of them, was by far the greatest pragmatist. His view, remember the famous letter he wrote before the war? If I can hold this thing together and keep slavery, I'm going to do that. If I can hold this thing together and get rid of slavery, I'm going to do that. If I can hold this thing together and keep slavery in some parts of the country and abolish it in others, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hold this thing together.
Right.
And then he winds up growing and growing and growing until he becomes our Lincoln, the saint and the martyr.
Right.
But he was a pragmatist. Jefferson is always the dreamer. And, you know, he'd say, nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than this people would. You know? But Lincoln's like, and then Adams was like, you can say that, Jefferson, but you haven't freed a single slave.
Right.
How's it going to work?
Yeah.
And Abigail is like, do not criticize my husband. Do not.
Well, I think she was smarter than. Well, maybe I shouldn't say that she's been given credit for, but she's a
brilliant woman.
You read First Family and you begin to understand just what an impact she had on that period of history, and we'll never know because women were not awarded those stations during that time.
But look at other presidential couples, JFK and Jacqueline.
Mm-hmm.
She was not a policy person. Look at Ronald and Nancy Reagan.
But
But you see my point. Abigail Adams was basically a co-president.
Well, they
she
were
was
in
smart
love.
and engaged.
They were best friends, and they grew up in a rural area where they relied upon each other for everything.
But she had something that most first ladies don't have. The only one you can really put in her category is Eleanor Roosevelt. Where
That's good.
Which do you want to, in a crisis, to which one do you turn?
Yeah, and she's one of the only people who called Jefferson a liar to his face. Well,
a couple of times in different ways. And I love that part of this conversation where Abigail Adams says to Jefferson, I'm not going to be one of those who's just kind of blandly on board with your duplicities. I'm nailing you.
We probably sometime in the future need to do more reading and more discussion about Abigail Adams. But this week we're doing the second part of our Joseph Ellis conversation with some fun stuff in there.
And some dogs barking in the background.
So with that, we'll go to the show, accepting that I must say,
here it comes.
If you want to find out more about Joseph Ellis or perhaps get his books, now that we've talked about him so much.
Or send fabulous gifts or emoluments.
Go to jeffersonhour.com. You can find all that. And I'm only saying this because they make
tomatoes,
me,
books.
If you'd like to support the Thomas Jefferson Hour, we can't thank you enough.
Great. You cut my stuff out.
Yeah, and go to jeffersonhour.com. Click on the donate button, and you can find out everything you want to know. Join the 1776 Club, and you'll get access to all sorts of content that we're always adding to. So I'll keep it short, keep it brief. Let's go to the show.
What a fun conversation this is. Let's listen.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. And welcome to you, sir, Mr. Clay Jenkinson.
And we are not in the barn today. We are in studio because we had the chance by telephonic communications to talk with one of our dear friends, Dr. Joseph Ellis of Massachusetts.
We spoke with Professor Ellis last week about his book, First Family, and we speak with him again this week.
He's a great lover of history. He's written award-winning books. He's writing more. He's as funny and articulate and insightful as any historian that I've ever met, and he's a friend of ours. Our friendship goes back to the Ken Burns film.
Yeah,
on
you
Thomas
guys.
Jefferson.
We got him on the phone, and we were trying to get everything, all the levels set, and hit the record buttons, and you guys were off and running as usual before engineering was ready to absorb all of this conversation.
Well, let me tell you why. I read all the histories. I read everything I can get my hands on about Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt and other historical characters. And this is going to sound a little weird, but in most cases, I read what they have to say. Say John Meacham. I read what they have to say. I'm interested. I take notes. I write in the margins. But I'm seldom surprised. They go over ground that I know, but they don't wrestle with the key questions. Why was Jefferson wired the way he was?
Right.
What's the nature of his privacy? What's the nature of Jefferson's engagement with the world? Is he an honest man or is he a duplicitous man? When is he at his best and when is he not at his best? What were the friendships that mattered and what characterized them? How does he maneuver the very difficult problem of slavery and so on? They all touch on these questions, but Ellis just jumps in the ring and starts wrestling with them. And his insights, I think, are extraordinary. I think he has the best read of human nature of all of the historians that work on the founding generation. So when I read him, I read this book, First Family, on my iPad. I prefer to read a physical book, but I often read electronically too. And on an iPad, you can use your yellow marker and mark stuff, and then you can send yourself your own. And so
that's what I do.
And I marked this book up, and I kept thinking, that's an insight.
Uh-huh.
That's the best that's ever been said. He nailed that. And I don't think that of most historians, however much I'm impressed by them, and believe me, I am. But there's something about Joseph Ellis. It's either that our own temperaments are congenial, but I think it's because he's a humanist as well as a historian.
And I think he loves what he's doing.
And he loves to play with ideas. He's not stern. There's nothing stern about him. You can hear him self-mocking, humor. Mm-hmm. I mean, he is my kind of historian, and his books
Grounded.
illuminate.
We go over a lot of things in the course of this interview, some last week, some this week. I shouldn't call it an interview. It's a conversation.
As you know, you're here with the controls. You dial his number, and suddenly we're off and talking. You're like, wait, I'm still.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up again, because I did actually get the recorder going in time to capture
a few
bit
of those preliminary.
Yeah, and
you always say in interviews, don't start till we're starting.
Yeah, but I have learned with you that doesn't apply. Start.
My view is to turn the switch on and let Joe go.
With your permission, there was a great exchange. Mr. Ellis had some. What did he call it? Career advice for you. Yeah, could we listen to that?
But let me just say this: that when he wrote his book on Jefferson, American Sphinx, I bought it, and I turned out I'm in it. That he had seen me at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester.
You were part of the inspiration for
and
that
he
book.
said, that's when I realized that Jefferson was this zany, paradoxical guy. He said, I decided to write this book. And so I didn't know this. He didn't write to me and say, by the way, I'm planning to use this. And so this time when we picked up the phone, he said, hey, I have a career plan for you.
And we'll listen to that now with your permission.
Yeah, well, sort of.
Here's the advice Professor Ellis had for you, sir.
Clay, you might think about this as a suggestion,
All right.
Okay? You've made yourself an impersonator of some renown with regard to Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt, right?
Well, I'll do it, yeah.
Oh, I know what's coming here.
Yeah. You ought to think about Adams. There's some things you could do there that I think, set pieces and stuff. Well, just think about it. You don't have to answer that question now, but I'm just thinking of your career.
I'll tell you what, I'll come do it at the Antiquarian Society if you'll put me in the preface of your next book as the Adams guy.
I would make a deal on that. I'm willing to sell out.
Because I'll tell you what, my temperament is closer to Adams and my outlook is closer to Adams than it is to Jefferson. I love Jefferson, of course.
That's exactly what I'm saying, man. That's what I'm telling you.
Here's how I view John Adams. Jefferson is talking, in what I like to call the Jefferson music, all the man's up to it and we're born good and the progress and all this stuff. And Adams is listening to all this and his view is, have you looked around, Jefferson? Have you actually looked around much? Because that's not the way the world works at all. I agree with you. I kind of like your fairy tale. I wish we lived in that world, but have you actually looked around much, Mr. J?
The closest thing that a conversation of exactly that sort occurs is when they're both in France and it's about the Tripoli pirates. Jefferson thinks, look, we're going to just wage war against these people and sink all their ships and form a European Union of naval power. He's thinking almost like NATO, And Adams says, that's just great, except we don't have a navy, and nobody else in Europe is going to join us, and so we just got to pay them, And for right now, that's what we have to do. But
it's cheaper. It's an investment.
That's right.
But then he goes on. I mean, and the thing about Adams that makes him so appealing to me is that he has this exquisite sense of humor, and then he goes on to blow smoke rings with the ambassador.
That's right. Yeah, he's trying to get him down in the mountain. He says, if I can blow bigger smoke rings, it's an extra 1,000 pounds that we don't have to pay you. And he wins. In fact, he claims later on he defeated this guy in the smoke ring competition.
And what's so great about it is that he writes this exquisitely comic account of himself. Jefferson could never have written a comic account of himself.
I know. But Jefferson also would not be as conspicuously vain as Adams. Of course, Adams is aware of that and critical of himself.
Yeah, but see, your point, I think, is that we don't really know what Jefferson actually was. We only know the incredibly well-wrought persona he presented to the world.
Are we recording yet?
So we're back to today, and the answer to that question is self-evident. Yes, Joe, we were recording. The question is, to you, Clay, will you do it? Will you become John Adams?
I might.
Really?
I might, because I like John Adams more and more. As I grow older, I'm still a Jeffersonian. I still want to live
more conservative.
I'm resisting this, but I hear you.
Mm-hmm.
But as you look around the world and you realize that social engineering, however beautiful it is, the Great Society, the war on poverty, the national endowments for the arts, and so on, this kind of social engineering you do because you believe in living in an enlightened world, it butts up against a whole range of counter dynamics, human nature, human habit, people who have something to protect in a world that's unequal. And so as you grow older, you think these noble experiments in trying to create a fair and just society where people have a living wage and are treated identically in the law, of course these are your goals, but you also realize they really are deeply challenged by the way the world has always worked and appears to continue to work. And as you know, David, that's very disappointing to realize how deeply ingrained are the habits of illiberalism and selfishness, and how deeply rooted are institutions that really don't hold up under any rational scrutiny. And so as you grow older, you sort of see, well, that's what John Adams was saying. He was saying, however you try to socially engineer a better world, you're going to have to face certain perennial problems and issues in life that are going to frustrate you. And if you're not prepared to face them, you'd better get out of the arena, because the world doesn't just conform to a more enlightened pattern because it should or because you thought of it. It takes enormous, glacial, gradual work over generations to make a better world. And that's hard for a young person to accept. It's hard for an idealist to accept. And maybe it's wrong. But the person who says the real world is more complex than you could ever dream is John Adams.
There's another section from the pre-interview conversation that you and Professor Ellis had where you get a little deeper into the differences between Adams and Jefferson. I want to play that now.
Adams keeps sort of saying to Jefferson, why won't you stay in the ring and fight it out with me? Why won't you fight?
Right.
And Jefferson's like, recently there was an earthquake in Western Virginia, and I thought I'd write you a little bit about it. And a new edition of Livy might have been discovered. And Adams was like, I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about the meaning of our friendship and the meaning of the revolution. And I want you to acknowledge, Mr. Jefferson, that I was right more often than you and your partisans will admit.
You know, if you teach the correspondence at undergraduate level, which I did for many years, at some really great places, they all start presuming they're going to end up liking or loving Jefferson and finding Adams somewhat of a bore.
It's the opposite.
And the exact opposite almost always happens. And you don't have to rig it. It's just in the letters.
Because Jefferson ultimately is incapable of the generosity of spirit that would actually bring him to try to figure it out with Adams. He really wants to duck it. He wants to bob and weave, change the subject. And Adams is saying these are fundamental and eternal questions of culture, and who better than you and I to really wrestle them to the ground? And Jefferson just sort of looks away serenely.
I agree. And for me, Adams should be the man for our time. Jefferson was the man for the middle of the 20th century when the certainties were clear and it all looked easily, verified and wonderful. We need our icons to be imperfect now.
Well, we got him with Adams.
And
what do you think of Giamatti's Adams?
Oh, I think he's pretty good in the HBO series. He sort of looks like him, and
he sputters a lot.
And a lot of the dialogue in that HBO series comes right out of the correspondence. It's very historically based. Is as much a documentary about Abigail as it is about John. And Laura Linney plays Abigail, and I'm now in love with Laura Linney forever.
We're speaking with Professor Joseph Ellis this week on the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. And this week, we're continuing our conversation with the award-winning author, Professor Joseph Ellis, speaking about his book, First Family, Abigail and John Adams. You can find out more about Professor Ellis and his many books by going to jeffersonhour.com. You'll find links there. One thing we didn't get to talk to Mr. Ellis about was the immense effect Adams had on the creation of this country. I mean, he really didn't get credit for it. I mean, when you think about what he did in Europe and how he did it with little or no support, he was almost acting rogue. Going to the Netherlands and setting up.
He got our debt absorbed and restructured by Dutch bankers without consulting Congress. He just did it.
The country would not have made it.
It would have been a lot harder without this, and he just unilaterally did it. He also did things during the treaty process with Britain in Paris that he would never have gotten permission to do had he been in constant communication with the United States, but he just did it. And he later claimed that he gave us the breakthrough in the Treaty of Paris that ended the War of Independence, and his son John Quincy gave us the breakthrough that led to the Treaty of Ghent that ended the War of 1812, and that these two craggy, independent spirits traveling outside of their portfolio did yeoman service on behalf of America, but they probably would have been rebuked if there had been a way to call the State Department.
It's a great part in the book. The other thing that we didn't really talk about was how Abigail and John groomed their children for success in the Adams family dynasty.
No, when you read about Jefferson's letters to his daughters, you think, well, that's a fairly stern and pushy father. You must comb your hair in the first thing in the morning, and you learn your Livy and your in Latin and your Don Quixote in Spanish. If you want my love, you will do X and Y and Z. And you think, wow, that's not great parenting. And then you read John and Abigail Adams talking to John Quincy, and you think, no, I'll take Jefferson, because they are so demanding of him. They're basically saying, if you don't become president of the United States, you are nothing but a failure. Imagine that kind of parental pressure.
In the next part of our conversation, we turn to listener questions. The first was a question about how much Professor Ellis relied on letters, correspondence. Was it important in writing his book?
Absolutely, yes. They couldn't possibly have happened without them. I mean, they are the core. They're the nucleus. You've got to read beyond that. You've got to know context and be able to have groundings in other, but without question, the existence of the letters, without that, you couldn't have done the book.
The questioner goes on to say, the way the book and all of its historical details are essentially couched in a love story is a large part of what makes First Family such an enjoyable read.
Well, thank you. And because it was a love story, I'm telling their story. I mean, I'm channeling them. But I'm also a person who believes, as a historian, that there's a connection between ideas, feelings, between public and private, between things that are well known and things that are intimate, and that those are the way our lives really play out. Those are the way we live our time on this planet, and you get to see it there and experience it in a way that is palpable and meaningful to me beyond whatever political lessons you draw from it.
Yeah, we got another question. Another question from Scott Calder. He wants to know if you think that Abigail Adams liked Jefferson and whether or not you think she enjoyed debating with him.
She very much liked him, especially during their time in Paris, and then when she went to London and they were in communication, and then even in the early years of the Washington administration when she was in Philadelphia and he was Secretary of State. She was the lioness protecting her lair and protecting her husband after that. And when he undermined Adams and behind his back said nasty things about John Quincy as well, then she was his most his bitterest enemy.
She didn't really like debating with him. She was just telling him the way things were, right?
Right. I mean,
but just as a follow-up to that, Joe, the moment where Shays' rebellion has occurred and Jefferson writes her this, I like a little rebellion now and then. She could not have read that letter without having a kind of a moment where she thought, how reliable is this guy?
Yeah, she says something in another letter about that, saying he would not think that if he were there.
Right. I mean, you can say that from Monticello.
Well, he's writing from Paris, and it looks really like a really easy, little blood here and there. Yeah, great when it's happening 3,000 miles away and you don't have to deal with it.
You do tell that story so well about what great friends they were in Europe, and I'm recalling when they parted. And John and Abigail are riding in a carriage, but Jefferson was with them because they were reading to each other his recently published notes on the state of Virginia.
Notes on Virginia
That's right.
Together.
They're reading Notes on Virginia as they take the carriage to the port to sail. Yeah.
And John Adams is real gracious and careful what parts of Jefferson's writing about slavery that he actually brings up.
He says the thoughts on slavery are worth diamonds. That's what he says. And, so he says something positive about it because there's some other stuff in there that he's avoiding.
He doesn't talk about his thoughts on race. It's only on slavery.
Right.
Nicolette Cagle writes in, and she noticed this phrase in one of Abigail's letters, the old oak and the willow. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Do you know the origin of that metaphor?
It's from an English poem.
It's from Edmund Spencer. It's from a poem by Edmund Spencer.
Okay, thank you, Clay. But it's a reference to Adams is the oak and Jefferson is the willow. And the oak will never bend, and the willow the willow's life depends on its bending. And it's a nice. I mean, it's not totally defamatory of Jefferson at all, and in some ways it's a critical of her husband. But it's, I think, appropriate.
One more. Jeff Ishii writes, wanting to know about the relationship between Dr. Benjamin Rush and the Adams family.
Yeah, they're very close, even though Rush is a Jeffersonian. I mean, politically, he sides with Jefferson in the 1790s, but he's a gadfly, and he's also the father of American psychiatry. He begins to think to practice the study of dreams. And there's a correspondence between Rush and Adams. I think Rush dies in 1814 or 15. So he, and they agree to share each other's dreams. And I've had these Jungian psychiatrists write me and say, this is the most revealing exchange I've ever seen. Both these people don't know, but they're both Jungian psychiatrists. Well, I mean, they I dreamed that I was at the French Revolution and they tried to guillotine me, but my head wouldn't come off, and that kind of stuff. And so that Rush, there's a kind of foreplay between Rush and they're like the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland in this. They're two writers who played with each other this way. In fact, the Adams-Rush correspondence in some ways is more stylistically brilliant than the Adams-Jefferson correspondence, but that it doesn't hit all of the big notes. But it's that relationship with Adams that causes Rush to then say, I need to bring you together. And then Rush is somewhat duplicitous or in a diplomatic way. He writes Jefferson and says, Adams wants to resume the correspondence, which is not true. And then he writes Adams says, Jefferson wants to resume the correspondence. And Adams says, I know you're talking both ways, but you don't need to do this. We'll get back.
We'll work it out. So, Joe, your dogs are about to chew your ankles off. We're going to let you go here, but I want to ask you one last question, and it's sort of like you've been writing about this all of your life. John Adams seems to have believed that whatever he did had integrity if it wasn't particularly popular, and if he did anything that was popular, it probably lacked integrity. And so if you think about the paradox of that,
yes,
that's a pretty significant psychological revelation in itself. Freud, I think, would want to have some fun with that, but
it almost makes a virtue into a. It's almost too much. I mean, it's almost perverse.
it is perverse. So what do you make of this? I mean, he really does have it because he says it over and over again.
No, that's the way he really thinks and feels. That the danger in a republic is that you'll be responsive to popular opinion in ways based on your desire to be reelected. And the virtuous person is the person who resists any popular whim in order to act in the interest of the public, which is the long-term interest of the people, which at any given moment the people might not perceive. And therefore, by not going to war against France in 1799, 1800, and if he had done that, he would have won the presidency. He loses the election, but he says it's the greatest thing I ever did, because I avoided a war that we were not ready for.
And of course, this makes him think that Jefferson, who seems to really like being popular, must be someone that you can't ultimately fully respect, because he loves to be loved, and Adams likes to be disliked.
Right.
But then it works out for Adams. It may be a neurosis, Joe, but when he sends that second mission over to France and they work out the peace, then he says, that's how I want to be remembered. If I get remembered by history, I want to be remembered.
But the peace is too late to affect the news of the peace arrives too late to affect the election.
Right. And he's sorry that he's not reelected, but he knows that history is going to vindicate him.
Well, when Jay comes back from his negotiation of what is called the Jay Treaty, one of the most unpopular, but in the long run, valuable treaties ever written, Adams says this is a sign he should succeed Washington. That is, he is the best guy. How do we know he's the best guy? Because he did the unpopular thing, because they're burning effigies to him up and down the Atlantic coast.
He must be good.
That's the guy we want. Anybody who wants to be president too much is ineligible.
Joe, you write a lot in the book about the time that John and Abigail spent apart, a great deal of time. This great phrase you use, the paradox of proximity, and because they were apart, we have all of these letters that they wrote to one another. There's one scene where John is heading to Boston to sail to Europe, and Abigail is just so distraught that she can't face him leaving.
Remember, distance is a big deal then, and that when they leave, she doesn't know whether she's ever going to see them again, but that her own life is a life that is defined by his political agenda, and she must support that. But that they are embedded in each other in all senses of the term, and
they spent so much time apart. I think that's a big part of the book.
Yeah. And when they are apart, there's a time when she is clinically depressed. And the snow is built, you understand this in North Dakota, when the snow is building up in the middle of the wintertime and you're shut in and you got nobody, right? And it's like she's lonely. And he's not writing very often. And it takes 6 months for a letter to get from Paris to Braintree or Quincy. And it's dark outside and it's cold. And she's a 40-year-old woman.
She feels abandoned.
She feels abandoned. Yeah.
So I'll bring it up again, that great phrase of yours, the paradox of proximity.
Yeah. We know the most about them when they're apart. And when they're together, we don't know as much. So that we don't know as much about the relationship after they retire together. Though you can figure it out because of the correspondence with other people. But that, again, they are the most fully revealed couple in public life in American history, in large part because it is a letter-writing world in which the letters are on parchment that will survive forever, not in cyberspace, and also because they're apart so often. And therefore, the number of letters is really large, so that these are conditions that make possible the kind of understanding that we can develop of them that's never going to happen again.
But there's another element to that, Joe, because, I mean, if another founding father might have had a more conventional sort of spouse, and he may not have felt free to write so completely about what's
That's
going
right.
on in the world and his thoughts and his reading and his philosophy.
Right.
He had his intellectual equal in his spouse.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the letters between Martha and George Washington would not have been that interesting. The letters between Dolly Madison and James would not have been that interesting.
Or Jefferson and Martha.
And Jefferson. More in the case of Madison, because Madison's letters read like footnotes to insurance policies. And
there's touche.
One other thing I wanted to ask you about, and that, if Adams set himself up for criticism historically, it's the Alien and Sedition Acts. And in reading your book, I walked away from that thinking, this is Abigail's work.
It was, yeah. No, he went along. She strongly supported it. So, by the way, did George Washington. That if you recover the moment, it really is a moment when it's not as crazy as it seems. It is crazy in the end, especially the Sedition Acts, and he when they correspond about this, Adam says, I signed them, but so did you. You were vice president. You signed them too. That's not fair to Jefferson. That it is a bad moment, but it's because they are hounding him in the press, Adams. There's a funny exchange in which there's a guy in New Jersey that's the editor of a paper, interestingly called The Wasp, and he describes Adams as a guy who's just a big ass. And Abigail says to John, I know you have a big ass because you do have a big ass, but he can't possibly know that. I can say that, but he can't say that. And she's defensive about him. And these publishers are going after him. And that's the reason why her position on the sale, you want her to be more liberal than she in fact was.
One of the things that struck me from the book that I didn't fully understand was Adams' opinion of Benjamin Franklin. I mean, here we have Jefferson, who just idolizes Franklin, or it seems.
Indolence.
And then there's Adams, who he didn't think much of Franklin. Can you talk about that? Initially,
Adams got along very well with Franklin. I mean, they served together during the war in a positive way. Franklin's right there on the same committee with Jefferson and Adams that produces the Declaration. Though Franklin's a latecomer to the cause, really, the split happens in France where Adams can't stand Franklin's popularity and his indolence and his promiscuity, and they begin as friends. If you try to recover the world of the commissioners in France in the late 70s and 80s, it's all these guys are paranoid and just crazy. I mean, they're killing each other off, and so that there's spies all over the place, but that's where the relationship with Franklin really begins to fall apart. And when Adams is shown a copy of Franklin's autobiography, Adams says, "I lose heart because I know he will always be able to tell a story better than I can."
The time has come for us to take a short break. We're speaking this week with the author, Professor Joseph Ellis, about his book, First Family, John and Abigail Adams. You can find out more at jeffersonhour.com. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. I am joined again by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, the gentleman who portrays the president when he's here, Mr. Clay Jenkinson.
You mean when Jefferson is here?
Yes.
I'm always here. We do
You're
this
always
52
here.
times a year.
Yeah, for many years.
From the barn and from the studio. Today, the studio, because we're on the telephone with Dr. Joseph Ellis.
And looking back at all those shows, I'd be hard-pressed to come up with one instantly that was more enjoyable than this one. It's just so much fun to talk to Ellis.
Well, you know, when you're talking to somebody eminent, which we sometimes do, someone you look up to, you're often nervous and, kind of cautious because you're talking to somebody of that achievement. But he is so friendly that we just start almost laughing before we begin because so much of this is amusing and he has an exquisite sense of humor and he sees the ironies. And one of the things that I like about him is he sees Jefferson's ironies.
And then, of course, we mustn't forget Joe's wonderful companions, his lovely dogs, and they feel free to chip in with their opinions from time to time. It's part of the fun of talking to Joe. But Mr. Ellis has such a unique perspective on the characters of that time, particularly Jefferson.
He understands that Jefferson is an odd historical figure and that Jefferson either walled off different parts of his consciousness so that they didn't always have to communicate with each other, or Jefferson learned to believe his own myth of himself, or that Jefferson was sometimes not entirely honest. But you can see that he prefers Adams, but he also loves and respects Jefferson. And so I love that dynamic.
Great insight, a terrifically fun conversation. Let's go to it now.
And there will be more with Dr. Joseph Ellis.
Right now, I want to go back to a part of the conversation I found very interesting with you and Professor Ellis discussing Jefferson's character.
But what do you make of of this streak in Jefferson? One way to think about it would be, well, he loves rhetorical excess. He's just posing here. This is Jefferson in the way that Madison later said, you kind of got to factor things down if you really want to understand this guy. Or in some sense, is Jefferson a true believer?
He's a true believer in those principles, but they exist at a highly rarefied level, floating above real world stuff.
Yeah, it's like you say it in this book as you do in American Sphinx, but you say like Jefferson, to understand Jefferson, you have to understand that he lives kind of in an alternative universe, and he's put some pretty tight hinges on those doors.
Yeah.
And it works for him. He doesn't think that he's lying or that he's disingenuous. He's drunk his own Kool-Aid.
That's right. He would pass a lie detector test. Like, for example, I don't remember hiring this guy to libel you in the election of 1800.
It's just grocery money.
And we got the letters, and the letters are right there. The guys, he really, when he writes that to Abigail, and that was in some sense the central psychological claim of the book American Sphinx. Not that the problem with the title is it makes it sound like the book is about he's inscrutable, and he is a kind of Rorschach test where each generation discovers its own Jefferson. But there was a coherence to his political philosophy, and he knew what he believed in, and he believed in it, and it worked really great in 1776, and by 1861, it was the basic values of the Confederacy.
It's amazing that someone as radical as Thomas Jefferson could be a major player in the early national period. I mean, when he's at his most radical, he's a seriously radical thinker.
He is. He's utopian radical, and he really just does believe that the world is going to, that we're all going to be equal. And you're right. I mean, I think that but they said that about him then. I mean, in other words, people like Hamilton and Adams both said he was, a nutcase. And when Marshall, after he swears him in as president, he goes back and writes a note in his to a letter to somebody and says, "I see terrorism ahead."
Right, but he says maybe Jefferson himself is not one of those terrorists, but his followers.
That's right.
Followers are terrorists.
That's right. That's right. But Jefferson himself is not strong enough or committed enough to be the leader of such a band. Yeah, you're right. You're right. And Jefferson always was wary of Marshall. And I mean, like he used to say to people, whenever you speak to Marshall, don't say anything substantive because he will take it and he will twist
his
it.
Twistifications.
Twistifications. You remember that? Yes. And
what do you make of the sort of the Connor Cruz O'Brien critique about Jefferson? Like he's not just an intellectual voluptuary and a utopian radical. He's like dangerous. And Connor Cruz O'Brien says that letter, the famous letter, if there were one person in the world free, one
right.
Adam and one
right.
Eve.
The Adam Eve letter.
He says that no rational person can read this letter and not regard Jefferson as sort of a fiery, extraordinarily dangerous man.
He calls him Paul Pot.
Right. He calls him. He's the Paul Pot of his time. What do you make of that streak in Jefferson?
I had some very vague but real connection to the Cruiser. The Cruiser comes out of the Irish Troubles. And he did develop a kind of a very powerful affection for Burke, which is intellectually substantive, but that his emotional being is combustible. And when he wrote that book, he published the lead article in Atlantic.
Right.
And I don't agree with the O'Brien kind of temperament, but yeah, and he probably speaks to a certain politically correct group in the world right now that probably will find it convincing. So they went forward.
At this point, we're going to end our conversation, this time with Professor Joe Ellis. If you'd like to find out more about him and his books, go to jeffersonhour.com. But he will be back. As I understand, you've got a couple more of his books picked out, Clay.
And we're going to do His Excellency next, which is about George Washington.
I've begun that. It's great.
Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly about Washington and slavery, which marks him off as quite different from Thomas Jefferson.
What was her name? Ona? The slave that ran away from Washington that he was obsessed with?
No, I don't know.
You don't know this story. There's a great book about it. So.
I know there's a new book on this subject.
Mm-hmm.
He also is very interesting on Native Americans because Washington, basically at the end of his life, Washington thought, oh, what's my legacy going to be here? And he thought, slavery is just no good.
Mm-hmm.
I've got to do something. I've got to do something public.
Mm-hmm.
I have to do something that the world will take notice of. And he did. He freed all of his slaves at the death of his wife. And then he said, I'm going to do something so that we set up our relations with American Indians on a better basis. We just can't roll over them on our way to the West.
I'm
amazing.
Really looking forward to finishing reading that book and some of his others. Again, if you are interested to learn more about Professor Joseph Ellis and his many books, go to jeffersonhour.com. We'll have links there. You can visit his own website as well. And as long as you're going to jeffersonhour.com, there's a very easy way there to support the show, and we do appreciate it.
And I want to thank our listeners for sending in their own questions, some of which we've been able to work into these 2 Jefferson Hours, these special editions, because it makes me so happy to think that people are out there thinking about these subjects and taking the time to send in their questions, reflecting on their own points of view. That is proof that A, someone's listening, and B, that there's a continuing engagement with these historical questions.
Yes, and if you'd like to join the conversation, go to jeffersonhour.com, check us out on Facebook, and ask President Jefferson a question. But right now, sir, it is time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
One of Joseph Ellis's contributions to the historiography of the Revolutionary era is that he proves that when Abigail Adams wrote her famous Remember the Ladies letter to her husband in the spring of 1776, she meant it. She was being playful. It was another episode in the never-ending, good-humored war between the sexes, and yet she was perfectly serious, too. as her letters to others, including Mercy Otis Warren, indicate. Here's what Abigail Adams actually wrote in the famous letter. I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Wow. If you didn't know the context, you would not necessarily see these words as playful. Abigail is playing the language of the revolution right back at her husband. If the revolution is about freedom and equality, she argues, if you are really saying that human beings have an inherent right to life, liberty, and property and self-government, if you didn't know the context, you would not necessarily see these words as playful. Abigail is playing the language of the revolution right back at her husband. If the revolution is about freedom and equality, she argues, if you are really saying that human beings have an inherent right to life, liberty, property, self-government, which humans precisely do you have in mind then? Or rather, which are you willfully choosing to exclude from your glittering and seemingly universal formula of liberty? Historians have tended to think Abigail's famous pronouncement was more playful than pointed because of the mock outrage of her husband John's response. He called his wife saucy. He said he and his revolutionary colleagues would fight rather than submit to what he called the despotism of the petticoat, and he dismissed her petition. As for your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. Perhaps it was a nervous laugh. Maybe he was just lame. Maybe John Adams just didn't get it. As Thomas Jefferson was about to learn, once you throw open the doors to revolution, you cannot control everything that gets stirred up. With his usual bludgeoning wit, Great Britain's Samuel Johnson skewered the hypocrisy of men like Jefferson. How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? Johnson said. How do you write all men are created equal and buy and sell them for farm profit? Ellis praises Abigail Adams for what he calls, quote, her recognition that the very arguments her husband was hurling at Parliament and the British ministry had latent implications that undermined all coercive and non-voluntary systems of arbitrary power. Ellis speaks of the Pandora's box that John and his colleagues in the Continental Congress had opened. Particularly Jefferson, of course, the author of the famous preamble to the Declaration of Independence. The lesson seems to be, beware of employing universalist rhetoric. Some folks will conclude that you actually meant it to have universal application. Although Abigail Adams could be sharp-tongued, just ask Jefferson, she was seldom tart with her husband John, whom she loved deeply, passionately, and perpetually, in spite of her awareness that he was a rotund, bald, toothless man with what he called a quiveration in his hands, in spite of the fact that she knew John Adams was vain, boastful, pompous, thin-skinned, and beset with insecurities and personal demons. Managing John's volatilities was a significant part of Abigail's life work. She knew he was under tremendous pressure in the spring of 1776, and she did not want to be as angry assertive as the famous feminist Mary Wollstonecraft. Still, she saw that there was no legitimate reason to exclude women from the revolutionary formula being bandied about by her famous husband and his male pals. She knew that the law of logical consistency meant that any attempt to deny women equal rights was arbitrary, the triumph of power over justice, and she reminded John Adams that demanding rights against those who would arbitrarily curtail or cancel them was, wasn't it, the very principle of the American Revolution. Did John Adams squirm, or wince, or sigh heavily when he read his wife's spirited letter? We want to hope that he rejoiced to have such a wife, someone who would stretch him, challenge him, tease him, push him, lure him, and at times even rebuke him. In other words, you want to hope that John Adams understood that public equality couldn't thrive on a foundation of private inequality. You hope that he understood that human rights begin at home. Adams' response to Abigail's Remember the Ladies letter was pretty lame. but at least it wasn't as lame as Jefferson's would have been. Adams had the good sense to disarm the discourse with humor, trembling over the despotism of the petticoat and all of that. Jefferson would have written one of his earnest dissertations about the God of nature and natural gender specialization, arguing that the benign creator had designed women for the sacred duties of the nursery. Blah, 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 Mr. Jefferson. Still, it was Jefferson and no one else who launched those magnificent revolutionary words. As usual, he tried to pierce through the immediate issue, independence from Britain, to get to the universal principle, and as usual, he nailed it. Nobody has ever understood this genius of Jefferson as well as the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. In a letter in 1859, Lincoln wrote, "All honor to Jefferson, to the man who, in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence by a single people, had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men and all times, and so to embalm it there that today and in all coming days it shall be a rebuke and a stumbling block to the very harbingers of reappearing tyranny and oppression." Do you see what Lincoln is saying? Under concrete pressure to write a merely revolutionary document, Jefferson wrote an abstract truth applicable to all men and at all times, and what he wrote will forever serve as a rebuke and stumbling block to even the first hint, the harbingers of reappearing tyranny. In other words, under incredible pressure and on the fly in June 1776, Jefferson wrote sentences in the preamble of the Declaration of Independence that represent better than anything else ever written the eternal standard of human rights. The fact that those very sentences now convict Jefferson of being a relatively bad exemplar of his own perfectly stated principles is perhaps too bad for Jefferson the man, but they illustrate Jefferson the magnificent revolutionary genius, and they have helped to liberate hundreds of millions of people worldwide, perhaps billions, which seems to me infinitely more important than Jefferson's personal and behavioral limitations. In other words, Jefferson did, in some sense, remember the ladies. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.